He left a single-dollar bill on the counter, smoothed flat, weighted down with a salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away. Then he slid off the stool, pulled his cap a little lower, and walked out of the little diner without another word, while the old woman behind the counter was turned away at the grill. She didn't recognize him, not as the famous man whose face was on movie posters all over the city, and not, though this was the part that would undo her later, as the starving 22-year-old kid she'd quietly saved in that exact same seat 30 years before. Stay with me to the very end of this one, because 3 days after he left that single dollar on the counter, that man came back through the door of the failing little diner, and what he was carrying and what he finally told her is a story I promise you'll be thinking about long after this video ends. The diner was called Dot's, and it was dying. It sat on a tired corner of a tired street, the kind of place the city had quietly forgotten. A long counter with cracked red stools, a row of booths with the vinyl patched in duct tape, a hand-lettered menu that hadn't changed its prices in a decade because the woman who owned it couldn't bear to. For 40 years it had served eggs and coffee and meatloaf and pie to cab drivers and night shift nurses and lonely old men who had nowhere else to be. And for 40 years it had been run by the same woman. Her name was Dorothy, but nobody had called her that since the Carter administration. Everyone called her Dot. She was 73 years old now, with silver hair pinned up under a hairnet and forearms like a woman half her age from 40 years of carrying plates. She knew every regular's order before they sat down. She knew which ones were having a hard month, and quietly gave them an extra scoop of potatoes without ever mentioning it. She'd kept the place open through recessions and rent hikes and a whole world changing around her, on stubbornness and black coffee and a refusal to let the lonely people of her neighborhood have nowhere warm to go. But stubbornness doesn't pay a lease. The rent had tripled. The neighborhood was changing in the way neighborhoods do, with glass and steel rising up where the old shops used to be. And the math had finally, fatally, stopped working. Taped to the inside of the front window that week was a sign Dot had written herself, in shaky marker, and cried the whole time she was writing it. After 40 years, Dots will be closing. Thank you for letting Emmy feed you. With love, Dot. It was an ordinary gray afternoon when the man in the cap came in. He looked like nobody in particular. Plain jacket, ball cap pulled low, the kind of man you'd never look at twice. He sat down at the counter, at the end stool, the one nearest the window, and Dot came over with the coffee pot and a tired, genuine smile, the same smile she'd given 10,000 strangers. "Coffee, hun?" "Please," the man said. "Just coffee." She poured it. He wrapped both hands around the mug like it was something precious, and he looked around the little diner slowly, at the cracked stools, the duct-taped booths, the closing sign in the window, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something soft and far away and almost grieving. What Dot didn't know, what she had no possible way of knowing, was that the man at the end of her counter was Jonah Keller. And if she'd kept up with movies, which she didn't, she'd have known that face from 100 films. A face that filled theaters. A man who could not walk down most streets in the world without being mobbed. And what she really didn't know, the thing that would break her heart open 3 days later, was that Jonah Keller had sat on that exact stool before. 30 years before. When he was nobody at all. Let me take you back, because you have to understand it to understand what comes next. 30 years earlier, Jonah Keller had been 22 years old and starving, not the dramatic kind of starving people say when they're a little hungry, the real kind. He'd come to the city with a duffel bag and a dream of acting, and the city had spent 2 years grinding that dream into the pavement. He'd run out of money, run out of couches to sleep on, run out of hope. On the worst night of it, he'd been down to a single crumpled dollar bill in his pocket, and a one-way decision half made in his head. Tomorrow he'd give up, call his father, admit he'd failed, and go home for good. That night, cold and shaking, he'd walked into a little diner on a tired corner because the lights were on and it was warm. He'd sat down at the end stool, the one by the window, and he'd ordered the only thing his single dollar could buy: a cup of coffee. He'd planned to nurse it for as long as they'd let him, just to be somewhere warm before the end of everything. And a younger Dot, 43 then, dark-haired, already running the place, had taken one look at him and seen straight through it. She'd seen the hollow cheeks and the shaking hands and the duffel bag that was clearly everything he owned. She hadn't said a word about it. She'd just poured his coffee, and then a few minutes later she'd set down in front of him a full plate. Eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, the works, steaming hot. "I didn't order this," he'd said, panicking, because he had exactly $1. "I can't, I only have. Kitchen made it by mistake," Dot had said. Which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie. "Can't sell it now. You'd be doing me a favor eating it so it doesn't go to waste." She'd slid it closer. "Eat, hun. You look like you need it more than the trash can does." He'd eaten. God, he'd eaten. And when he was done, near tears, he'd put his single crumpled dollar on the counter, all the money he had in the world, because he had to pay for something. He had to keep some scrap of his dignity. And Dot had looked at that single dollar, and she'd taken it, because she understood that letting him pay was its own kind of mercy. But then she'd leaned on the counter and said the thing he would carry for the rest of his life. "Tell you what," she'd said, "I'll take your dollar today. But someday, when you've got more than $1, and you will, you go and do this for somebody else. That's how you pay me back. Deal?" He'd promised, and then she'd done one more thing. She'd looked at this broken kid who was about to quit, and she'd said, "And whatever it is you came to this city to do, don't you go home yet. Not yet. You've got a look about you. The ones who make it always look exactly this beat up right before they do." He didn't go home. He stayed, and within the year, the door he'd been knocking on for 2 years finally opened, and the rest became 30 years of films and fame and a face the whole world knew. But Jonah Keller never forgot the night a stranger fed him for free, took his last dollar to save his pride, and told a beaten kid not to give up. He'd tried to find the place again over the years, but the city changes, and memory is a slippery thing, and he'd never been sure he could find the exact corner. Until that gray afternoon when a film brought him back to the old part of the city, and he turned a corner he half remembered, and there it was. Dot's. Still standing, with a closing sign in the window. So he'd come in, and he'd sat on the end stool by the window, the same one, and he'd watched the same woman, 30 years older, still moving up and down behind the counter. And he hadn't said a word about any of it, because he wasn't ready, and because he wanted for just a few minutes to simply watch. And while he watched, the door opened, and a kid walked in. The kid was maybe 19, 20, thin cold A backpack that was clearly everything he owned. He sat down a few stools away and stared at the menu with the particular desperation of someone counting coins in his head and coming up short. And Dot, 73-year-old Dot, 3 weeks from closing the diner that was her whole life, walked over with the coffee pot and her tired, genuine smile, and Jonah Keller watched the entire thing happen again. He watched her read the kid in a single glance. He watched her pour a coffee that wasn't ordered. He watched her, a few minutes later, set down a full plate of food and say something about the kitchen making it by mistake. Can't sell it now. You'd be doing me a favor. He watched a starving kid's eyes fill up. He watched the whole miracle repeat itself. 30 years later, performed by an old woman who was about to lose everything and was still feeding the hungry strangers who walked through her door for free on her way out the door herself. And Jonah Keller, the famous man at the end of the counter, had to look down into his coffee so that nobody would see what was happening to his face. When he could trust himself again, he stood up. He didn't say anything. He wasn't ready, and he had something to arrange first. But he reached into his pocket, and he took out a $1 bill, and he smoothed it flat on the counter, and he weighted it down with a salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away when the door opened. The same gesture. The same $1 from the same stool. Then he pulled his cap low and walked out, while Dot was turned away at the grill. She found the dollar a few minutes later. Just a single, ordinary dollar under the salt shaker, left by the quiet man in the cap who'd only ordered coffee. She thought it was a strange tip. She tucked it in her apron and didn't think much more about it. She had a diner to close and 3 weeks to do it in. For 3 days, nothing, and then, on the 3rd day, the door opened, and the man in the cap came back. Except this time he wasn't alone, and he wasn't quiet, and he was carrying a leather folder under his arm. And this time, when he took off the cap, the young cook who'd come out from the back made a strangled sound and dropped a spatula, because the young cook went to the movies, and the young cook knew exactly whose face that was. Dot, the man said gently, crossing to the counter. I owe you a conversation that's about 30 years overdue. She looked at him, confused, wiping her hands on her apron. Do I? I'm sorry, hun. Do I know you? And Jonah Keller smiled, and his eyes were already wet, and he said the thing I told you about at the very beginning, the thing I haven't been able to shake since I first heard it. You fed me once, he said, 30 years ago. Right there on that stool by the window. I was 22 and I was starving and I had $1 to my name and I decided to give up and go home the next morning. And you put a plate of eggs in front of me and lied and said the kitchen made it by mistake. And you took my last dollar so I could keep my pride. And you told me to pay it forward someday. And you told me not to go home yet. That the ones who make it always look exactly that beat up right before they do. His voice broke. I didn't go home, Dot, I stayed. Because of you. Everything I have, every single thing, started with a plate of eggs you said was a mistake. Dot's hand was over her mouth now. She was shaking her head slowly, the memories swimming up out of 40 years of faces. The boy with the duffel bag, she whispered, by the window. You were so thin. I thought about you for years, wondered what happened to. She stopped. She looked at the man standing in front of her. Really looked, and she understood that the beat-up kid with the duffel bag and the man on the movie posters were the same person, and she had to grip the counter. I came in 3 days ago to find you, Jonah said. And I sat on that same stool. And I watched you do it again. I watched you feed that kid for free on your way out the door, 3 weeks from losing this place. Still doing it. After everything, he set the leather folder down on the counter, next to the salt shaker. And I went and I made some calls. And I came back. He opened the folder. Inside was a contract, signed, his signature already on it. Jonah Keller had bought the building. The whole building, the tripled rent, the lease, all of it. And the contract did not transfer it to him. It transferred ownership of Dot's Diner, free and clear, debts erased, to Dorothy herself, for a purchase price, written right there in the legal language, of $1. "You took my last dollar 30 years ago," Jonah said quietly, and he reached into his pocket and laid a single-dollar bill on top of the contract, the same one he'd left under the salt shaker, smoothed flat. "So I'm buying you the building with it. $1. We're square on the dollar now. But the eggs," his voice gave out for a second, "the eggs and the staying and the not going home, that debt I'm going to be paying for the rest of my life. This is just the first installment. There was more in the folder. A fund set up in Dot's name to keep the diner running long past the day she couldn't run it herself, with one clause she'd insisted, when she finally read it through her tears, was the only part that really mattered to her. Written into the legal documents, in plain language, a permanent rule for as long as the diner stood. Anyone who walks in hungry and can't pay still eats. The kitchen makes mistakes on purpose. Forever, Dot didn't say thank you. She couldn't. She just came around the counter, this 73-year-old woman in a hairnet, and she put her arms around the most famous man in the country like he was still the starving kid by the window, and the two of them stood there in the middle of the saved diner and cried. I think about this story more than almost any other I know. And not because a movie star saved a diner, though he did. The part that stays with me is the dollar, the single dollar, traveling across 30 years. Because here's the thing. When Dot fed that starving kid, she had no idea who he'd become. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't going to do anything for her. He was a nobody about to disappear. And she fed him anyway, and took his last dollar to save his dignity and told him to pass it on. That's the only reason it counted. She wasn't investing in a future movie star. She was just being kind to a hungry kid because he was hungry and she had eggs. That's it. That's the whole thing. And 30 years later, that single act of no-strings kindness came walking back through her door, carrying everything she needed in a leather folder. Not because she'd earned a reward, she'd never once thought about a reward, but because that's what kindness does when it's real. It doesn't disappear. It goes out into the world and it travels, sometimes for decades, and every so often it finds its way home. But here's the part I really want you to hear. Dot didn't get rescued because of the kindness she did 30 years ago. She got rescued because of the kindness she was still doing. Feeding a hungry kid for free. 3 weeks from losing everything, when she had every reason in the world to stop. The dollar from 30 years ago opened the door. But it was the plate of eggs she gave away on her way out that proved she'd been worth saving the whole time. She never stopped. That's who she was when no one important was watching. And it turned out someone important had been watching after all. Except he was never important to her. He was just a hungry kid she once fed. So here's what I'll leave you with. You are never going to know which act of kindness is the one that travels. The coffee you buy a stranger, the meal you give away, the beaten-down kid you tell not to give up, you will almost never see where it lands. Most of it you'll forget by the next morning. But somewhere out there, a single dollar you didn't think twice about is making its way across the years, and someday, when you least expect it, it just might come walking back through your door. Pay it forward anyway, especially when there's nothing in it for you, especially then. If this story moved you, leave one word in the comments forward for the promise Dot asked for and the kid kept. Just so I know you made it all the way to the end, and so I know there are still people out there who'd put down a plate of eggs and call it a mistake. And if you believe the kindest people are the ones still giving on the very worst day of their lives, then subscribe. Because those are the only people we make stories about on this channel. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.